Hey, Adapters, welcome back. Joining me is Judge Alice Hill. Alice is a David Rubenstein Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Alice's work at CFR focuses on the risks, consequences, and responses associated with climate change. Alice previously served as Special Assistant to President Obama and Senior Director for Resilience Policy on the National Security Council staff, where she led the development of national policy to build resilience to catastrophic risks. Alice will help us discern how climate change impacts national security and why definitions of national security that solely focus on military responses may not protect human security adequately in a changing climate. She talks about how climate change can affect military readiness and how soft power is necessary to achieve national security goals. Hey, Alice, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I'm really delighted to join you.
Well, I'm excited to get you on Simpatico. We've chatted before, and it's always just a treat to learn what you're doing and get your recommendations on things. So definitely, let's just start off by what is the Council on Foreign Relations for people who aren't familiar with it?
Council on Foreign Relations is over 100 years old. It's born out of the idea that we want more people to understand international relations. So it's a membership organization. People apply and then they participate in the convenings that the council has. Most of the members, I would say, are former ambassadors, CEOs, people who have global experience and who appreciate the fact that what happens in the rest of the world will very likely affect what happens here in the United States. So it has a reputation for fierce independence for scholars, but also for trying to inform the collective dialogue about international relations.
And can you briefly just describe some of your, roles and responsibilities when you were on the National Security Council?
Sure. At the last point, when I was on the National Security Council, I was Senior Director for Resilience Policy on the National Security Council. And of course, the National Security Council is the group within the White House, the executive branch, that determines national security issues, including foreign relations issues. It's headed by the National Security Advisor. Under President-elect, that will be Jake Sullivan. When I was in the Obama administration, it was Susan Rice. And then that council meets and pulls together the leaders from the State Department, from the Department of Homeland Security, other major security agencies, and they help the president form our international policy as well as our national security policy. Within that group, I headed a team of directors who were responsible for resilience policy. And resilience policy can mean everything from resilience within the United States, but also resilience of our overseas investments. Through example, the development agencies that we have, where we give aid to other countries as they are attempting to improve themselves or recover from some humanitarian disaster. So I led that, and I also served simultaneously on President Obama's climate team because we were working on the various policies to promote reduction of emissions, but also building resilience to climate change impacts, including droughts, extreme rainfall, wildfires, those types of really severe events that can threaten national security as well as homeland security.
I guess I didn't think about that. When I think of the National Security Council, I usually think of international issues, but domestic resilience, that you just mentioned, that's something that was covered in that area, and that was just considered under like the purview of what you're doing at NSC?
Well, that actually has an interesting history. After 9/11, of course, the country was deeply concerned about terrorism. And then President Bush proposed the creation of a Homeland Security Council, and that ran in parallel with the National Security Council. When President Obama came into office, he decided that that was cumbersome. And typically the president, the very first thing they do, they issue a directive on how they're going to organize themselves, most importantly, the National Security Council. And so in President Obama's first directive, he basically combined the two, so that it included Homeland Security elements as well as the international elements. I was in technically a Homeland Security department, but because I was on the climate team, I ended up, and I was the only national security representative for resilience on the climate team, my portfolio greatly expanded.
Interesting. All right, let's start off with an easy question. So what is the connection between climate change and national security? You sort of alluded to some of this, but maybe sort of kind of broadly, those two subjects are just getting more and more attention.
Sure. Well, it all depends on how you define national security. If we take national security in the very narrow definition of military protection, military might for the nation, climate change has a number of direct impacts in these extreme events I've been talking about, the wildfires, the rain, the drought, in that it affects our installations. So we've seen Air Force bases completely demolished to the tune of $3 billion. We know Norfolk, which is a center of military might for the United States, probably the largest naval installation in the world. We have all the services represented there, but deeply threatened on that mid-Atlantic seaboard by sea level rise, both because the land is sinking as well as the seas are rising. And that does already affect their operational readiness. So our installations are going to be not as strong because they have to withstand these impacts. It's also already affecting our training. For example, in the American West and on our bases, we can't sometimes do live ammunition firing because of the risk of wildfire. In some instances, it's been too hot for very young, healthy men and women to be training outside. It's just dangerous. And then there is a larger question of whether our weaponry and our other assets will function in very changed conditions, very hot temperatures. And we need to think through that. And the third sphere is humanitarian aid. The United States is the biggest provider of humanitarian aid. It is often on the scene the first, and the people that are on the scene the very first are the military, because they have so many assets all over the globe and can deploy very quickly. So as we see more disasters occurring, the military is called upon to provide support overseas and also here domestically as well through the National Guard and others. And some military officers have expressed concern that that could affect military readiness going forward.
All right. So what about some examples overseas? Because, sometimes we get caught up in other countries that are going through these crises. How has climate change impact some other countries, and what's happened? What's been an outcome of that?
Well, I think one of the very first instances where the national security community said, wow, this could be big for us, were the droughts in Syria. And Syria experienced, before the unrest, a drought of that estimated that had not occurred for at least 1,200 years. And as a result of that, many farmers found that they could not make a living anymore. And so many young men, mostly it was young men, moved to urban areas. That is very typical when the farming agriculture collapses. People migrate to the cities to find work. That occurred, there was not work available, and that led to civil unrest, and of course many other factors played in. But the drought acted as a threat multiplier. It just added pressure to pre-existing disputes and conflicts among people, and then there were reduced resources available. There were more demands on housing, food, and that added fuel to the fire. And of course, then we saw eventually a very significant migration out of Syria, a migration that frankly challenged, even though in comparison to what we expect with climate change, it was only about 5 million people, but that was very challenging for our European allies. It gave us a glimpse of what's ahead. The International Red Cross has estimated that by 2050, 200 million people a year will be displaced by climate change. Most of those will just move within country, which will be disruptive enough on its own, but some of them will be crossing international borders. So that's the type of destabilizing event when you have that many people on the move and that many people in demand. So that's on the traditional military side. On the more broadly defined security, which would be human security, climate change affects everything: our access to food, water, shelter. These events undermine our ability to provide for our populations, for ourselves, and that will be very destabilizing to governments. And again, it will cause more people to be on the move. Yemen is a really stunning example of this, already a very water-stressed country, but it's expected to get much drier in the coming years. But it recently has had a number of flood events, and those flood events are worsened in areas that are already suffering drought because the water hits that pancake, flat, hardened soil, and there's just no place for it to go. So a country that's already seeing a lot of civil unrest, its government is very challenged by this, and we've seen Al-Qaeda take advantage of that. A common thing that happens when governments are stressed by these types of events is that opportunists, often ones that we consider dangerous to the United States, take advantage. Same thing happened during severe flooding in Pakistan in 2011. The Taliban took advantage of the Pakistani government's very slow response to that flooding event.
All right. So when the military gets involved, usually that's a sign of the last resort in, I guess, dealing with a situation. So the issue of soft power, I mean, first off, could you define what soft power is and what role does it play in national security and climate change?
Well, hard power would be military might. So you arrive with your tanks. That's definitely hard power. Soft power is through diplomacy and development work. And that can be just as effective in military might. I would say more effective when it comes to climate change, because with climate change, there's no one to shoot. There's no hill to climb. It's about trying to help others cope with the climate stresses that they're experiencing. And so that would be through soft power, which was diplomacy, helping understand what those countries need, perhaps giving them help with capacity building, how they can learn better how to plan for these events, prepare for them. And it can also mean giving them substantial aid to undergo work to better prepare themselves. Right now, a very big topic is debt relief for countries, because many of the developing nations have incurred a lot of debt. But as you can imagine, with COVID, their tax revenues, their revenues are way down. So they need to pay that debt. They need to pay their loan, their interest payments, but they also need to take care of their populations. So for richer nations who are better able to weather these type of catastrophes, there's a big international discussion about trying to do more. In fact, the Pope recently called on international institutions to rethink how we issue debt for struggling nations. And that has components of national security, because if those nations can't take care of their own populations when flooding occurs, those populations tend to may turn, not always, but can turn to opportunists. And certainly we've had many examples during the pandemic of exactly that happening. So we can anticipate that will continue to occur as climate worsens.
Well, I mentioned the Paris Climate Agreement is probably an example of soft power diplomacy between nations, and its goal is to reduce carbon emissions. But I guess you could also look at it; it's trying to preempt some of these, destabilizing events. That's going to be an outcome of that if you do it right.
Right. In the long term, we all want to avoid the unmanageable effects of climate change, and the heating that we would have if we do not mitigate our emissions would be basically unmanageable. Certain areas of the globe will become uninhabitable. The people who are there now will want to find other places to live. That's going to cause a lot of people to be on the move. So we want to cut our emissions to avoid the very worst of climate change. Meantime, if we cut our emissions to zero tomorrow, just because of the delayed effects of climate change, we will continue to experience severe worsening events for at least the next several decades, probably longer because we cannot get our emissions to zero today. And we need to help other countries be prepared to withstand those impacts so that they can thrive and they don't crumble from within because of some climate events or accumulation of climate events, which is really how this will probably play out.
Okay, so I got a question coming in from the community room from Ken. And how vulnerable are Central and Latin American countries to major climate-related destabilizing events?
Very.
Okay.
Very. Particularly that Northern Triangle, where we've seen so much migration, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And those areas are mostly dependent on agriculture, a lot of small held farms, producing a lot of coffee. And as temperatures warm, that coffee gets a coffee rust on it, and it destroys the plant, and you have to essentially cut down the plant and then replant it, and that's about a 3-year process. So we have seen in recent years, and I was at the Department of Homeland Security before I went to the White House, and about 2012, I may be off by a year, we started seeing a huge influx of children from the Northern Triangle. Historically, the migration pressures we see on the southern border are from Mexico. But we saw this huge surge of children, and climate change wasn't the cause of those kids being on the move, but it was a threat multiplier. And that's really what climate change does. It makes things worse. And so as coffee rust occurred, and those countries in particular are very vulnerable to natural hazards, and they had a significant drought, which affected them. We saw these kids heading north, which has continued, as we know. And we will see, no matter how large a border wall, how tall a border wall we build, we will see continued flows of people from Central America. They don't fit in any current definition we have for a refugee. There is no such thing technically as a climate refugee. So there aren't really a lot of rights for them, but there are going to be a lot of people still seeking relief because they're homeless. And I'll just add this: Hurricane Mitch in 1999 hit Honduras, devastating. 7,000 people killed. It's the worst hurricane since 1780 for deaths.
Wow.
And that caused long-term decline in the economy there. Now Honduras is a very challenged nation, a lot of corruption, a lot of gang violence, huge homicide rate. But this November, they suffered 2 back-to-back hurricanes. So 150,000 people displaced. Those hurricanes happened to hit their commercial center where 2 million people live. It's really, and we're already seeing more people heading north. So these climate-fueled events will cause greater stress and strains on the borders of the United States as we try to figure out how to help people be able to stay at home, which would be the best thing, is if we helped Honduras become stronger and have an economy that could better withstand these kinds of impacts.
So even as you described the last couple of years, the immigration that's occurring to the southern border, even if you can't directly, I guess, say climate change drove this, although you make it probably a strong argument, it's almost a trial run. You think of how politically it played out, how it became such a hot button issue, and the wall. And it's in its own way, it was sort of destabilizing to American politics because it was exploited to a certain extent. It is sort of a trial run, and like climate change is going to create this over and over again. And how do we respond? Well, I would argue we responded poorly in that case.
Well, if you think long term, I mean, the challenge is, okay, so we don't figure out a solution for these folks. and they become more and more desperate. And that gets back to the recruitment issue. So who is helping them? And during the pandemic, Mexico is very challenged with its cartels, as we know. During the pandemic, El Chapo Guzman's daughters put together boxes of sanitizer and other supplies to get families through the pandemic. And they stamped El Chapo's face on the boxes.
Wow.
Well, that kind of soft power influence of a cartel transnational crime aids to their recruitment, softens opposition to them in the community, and that becomes much more difficult to impose law and order and make sure that we have strong governance structures in place. And that ultimately can make the populations much more vulnerable. So we need to think through, what are we doing if we just say to everybody, we're not going to help you and you're going to muddle through this on your own, when we're talking about absence of shelter, water, security, food. People get desperate.
Okay, so we're going to get to the end of this episode, but I wanted to cover that we have a new administration coming in. President Biden will be the president in hopefully a month, and it's no news to anyone. I think it hasn't been a priority, climate change, in the Trump administration. And with your own government experience, what can we expect? What have you seen with appointments and such? I guess it should be more positive news.
Well, we'll see climate change front and center. There's no question of that. President-elect Biden ran on a climate platform. Everyone who he has appointed so far is well-versed in climate change and has they each have many ideas on how we can do better to address the climate threat, both cutting emissions and preparing. I think there are two significant things that will change compared to the Obama. The first is that there'll be now a person sitting on the National Security Council, which we talked about, solely responsible for climate change. So that's Senator John Kerry. He formerly head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and has been a deep advocate for action on climate change. So he's now the new climate envoy. That means he will cover the foreign relations, the diplomatic negotiation aspects of climate, as well as the national security. So that will, for the first time, elevate climate change as a national security issue in a very visible way for the United States. So I think we will see far more attention to what the military is doing to better prepare themselves and better address climate change. And then just recently, he's appointed his domestic head, the person that will oversee what happens in the United States in terms of climate change. And that's Gina McCarthy, who headed the EPA under President Obama. So her remit is to focus on how we can do better in the United States. And I think she brings a deep knowledge of the federal system, how the federal government is in support of state and local governments to encourage both mitigation as well as adaptation. I am less clear at the moment on what the adaptation agenda is for the Biden administration. I think we need to look carefully, see what they plan to do, because it's a difficult thing to adapt because it's so localized, but very important for us to get seriously embarked on that endeavor. We are just at the beginning, and this is a chance to make significant progress.
Well, I was in government, but certainly not the level that you were. And people look for signals, and the fact that, John Kerry was put in that position at that level, and he was former Secretary of State, that is a signal that, President Biden's going to take this seriously, because, sometimes you get appointed and I'll be curious with Jim McCarthy and her position. It's more of a domestic focus, like how much power and influence, because she obviously was a very influential EPA administrator. So it's a good signal he picked her, but it remains to be seen how, those sort of things play out in regards to where climate kind of gains traction. And do you think there's any value in having sort of a name or a secretary of adaptation or resilience, because it'll fall under, I think, her work? And does mitigation sort of get most of the attention? You know what I mean? It's just like, is adaptation worthy of its own kind of category and position?
I believe it is. Or certainly, it deserves more attention. It is like the poor cousin right now in terms of funding, in terms of just time and attention. But unfortunately, the climate impacts are quickly catching up. And if we don't figure out how to build more safely, how to make better land use choices, how to protect natural areas, we are in for a heap of trouble. So it needs to be prioritized, but it's lacking in funding and lacking in attention right now. And that's why we need to watch closely what the Biden administration does, because historically the big ticket item has been mitigation, and it's very important. We must cut our emissions, no question there. But now we need to do both.
Okay, before we wrap up this episode, you have written a book. It's a relatively new book. Do you want to put a plug in for the book and what you're covering in that?
Sure. It's called Building a Resilient Tomorrow. I have a co-author, Leo Martinez, and Leo served in the Obama administration with me in the Treasury Department. The book was born out of our concern that most people just don't appreciate how climate impacts affect virtually everything that we do. And until they can understand that, it's going to be slow going. So we set up the book to walk through various sectors where climate change will have a significant impact. The built environment, we've talked a little bit about that, but that means how we build homes, where we build, and our land use decisions. And then how do we insure those? Then we looked at finance. How are we going to pay for all this? What role does insurance play? Bonds, other kinds of means to pay for the types of changes we will need to do. We looked at the markets. There really is still a market failure in recognizing climate risk. I just don't think we're just at the edge of that. And then we walked through the cognitive biases that affect us, healthcare, how that will be severely impacted by climate change, as well as these national security risks and the deep inequality that a climate change brings, as we've seen with COVID. These catastrophic risks hit the most vulnerable the hardest. They punch them very, very hard, and we need to come up with better systems to help protect them, because it's really an unbearable load the way this falls.
Well, Alice, this has been a fantastic conversation. It is always a treat talking with you, and I hope it's the first of many on Simpatico that we can get you to talk about this. You're in the thick of these things, and your book was really well received. It's getting a lot of attention. We could go do a show around each chapter, and so that we want to brainstorm with you on those ideas. But thanks again for coming on. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much. Really a joy to connect with you again.